That's why with younger lifters, I actually encourage them to go to failure. Go until you can't get another rep. It's a teaching moment
Safely.
safely, but also because newbie lifters, they really, it's not really failure. There's a lot of central nervous system adaptation that takes place and coordination of just being able to recruit all the muscles necessary to execute a movement. And they just don't have that experience yet. I mean, you could compare it to shooting free throws. I mean, it's just over time with repetitions, your body, your nervous system just becomes more efficient and adapted to doing the movement and recruiting all the muscles. So I encourage failure for beginner lifters to learn exactly what you said. How do we know?
And that could be somebody that's 15 or somebody that's 50 if they're in their first 6 months or a year. You can still be a young trainer in your later years in life.
Yeah, particularly if you're using machines, you can go much closer to failure without, like you mentioned, concern for injury. Weightlifting has a very low injury statistic, anyhow. 65% of injuries in the gym are a result of dropping a weight on yourself. you know, so not lifting the weight necessarily. So uh, I'm not too concerned with that, particularly if we get into fixed movements, because you just at that stage of the game, you just don't have. I don't think what people appreciate is that that's not necessarily because the muscles fail. It's because your brain. There's a neural component, communication, and it's what we refer to as your perceived level of exertion, and it's a trainable component. And a lot of people talk about, um, you know, they tend to overemphasize uh, minimizing fatigue, which I just spent the first 20 minutes talking about. But the fact of the matter is that's a trainable trait. You can, obviously, the more you train, the more fatigue that you can endure and recover from. And so I'm cautious not to avoid it entirely. And I'm also cautious, as mentioned earlier, when I said that you can be careful with load management, that you don't acquire too much fatigue too fast by going too far beyond your current level of fitness. We see this in runners. You start out, you jog a mile, and the next thing is 2 miles, and it's 3 miles, and eventually you start overreaching. You start trying to do much more than your body is physically capable of, and that's when you start having injuries, usually repetitive strain, uh, or which can happen from too much frequency or too much volume. But injuries are generally, it's like when people go out and try and play softball on the weekend, or volleyball, or pickleball, like we were talking about earlier. You can't imagine that you could actually injure yourself. But when you get into the game and you start making attempts to do things that your body just isn't physically prepared for, and you overextend yourself, then that's when the next morning you wake up and all of a sudden you can't move. Those are things that I like about weight training, is it's so measurable that there's no sense in going into the gym. And if you're a 225 bencher, you're never going to load 315 on the bar. But if you're a beginning volleyball player and you go out and start playing with your buddies, you might, jump and lunge and extend yourself well beyond your current level of fitness, just because you get caught up in the game. And we see it oftentimes in, as mentioned, the weekend softball player starts sprinting to first base and then tries to slide into second, and in between beers on the sidelines. That's when people get hurt. Pickup basketball is notorious for people getting injured just from moving at a pace that your body's not accustomed to. Even sprinting. I mean, for a while there, you might remember that bodybuilders, coaches were trying to get especially their female competitors, to start sprinting because they saw the physiques on the female sprinters were so phenomenal. Well, that's an extremely dynamic movement, and it was well beyond the level of fitness of many of these young women. And they were going out and pulling hamstrings and ending up with hip injuries, and just from going out there and trying to sprint as fast as they can right out of the gate, something they hadn't done in 10 or 15, 20 years. And so, I'm more cautious about the dynamic movements from sports than I am about lifting, because it's so measurable. And as mentioned, if you get somebody confined to a fixed movement like a seated bench press, as opposed to a seated bench press machine, or a chest supported row, as opposed to a T-bar row or a flat bench, you even minimize the exposure to injury even more, and it's more measurable and it's more repeatable, because part of the growing is being able to progress by repeating the same movements with either a little more weight or an extra repetition over time.
Yeah, you mentioned this overemphasis of fatigue management. And I don't know how I did it, Stan, but about 2 months ago, I ended up on the wrong side of the internet. I found these science-based lifters somewhere on Instagram, and now my feed has just been flooded with it. And I'm not an anti-science guy. I mean, you and I are having a scientific conversation here today. I came up in the world of bodybuilding under the likes of Ben Pekulski, Joe Bennett, very science-based guys. We talked about these things all the time. But what I've seen in the social media landscape these days is young kids absent of any real physical development. Like, these kids, in my opinion, should be testing their limits, should be pushing it to where they are blacking out and I mean nosebleeds. And I mean, we had sessions back in the day, saying you've had probably far beyond what I've done, where you literally feel like you've reached the limit of death. Like, you go up there, you high five Jesus, he says, all right, we're going to send you back there to kind of accomplish the mission. But what are your thoughts? I'm sure you've seen some of this stuff as well. It's just these young kids. This is getting us off of the 40 conversation, but we'll loop it all back, because I think this can be valuable, because maybe some of the people hearing this are going to follow that. And I think that there's obviously some truth behind it, but to me, I think they're missing the boat with where they are in life right now.
Yeah, there is a bit of a divide here, a push and pull between, what may be considered bro science versus science. I have a science degree. I'm a CSCS. I've, dissected cadavers and taken anatomy and phys and kines and bio, and I'm familiar with all of that, and I stay current on the literature, and I follow the people who have PhDs in science who also lift, and all of them, the PhDs in science who also lift and compete at a high level, they push themselves pretty hard. And as mentioned, we're having two different conversations here. We talked about people in their 40s or 50s or at the end of their career should be cautious about load management in terms of injury prevention and recovery, because they have a decreased recovery ability due to other aspects in life, as mentioned. And then the young cats who have almost, I'm envious. They have such capacity to grow. But as I mentioned earlier, and Pat Davidson, Exercise Phys PhD, is a great resource in the industry, has said that's a trainable quality, as mentioned. And that's why I think that young lifters should push themselves. I don't necessarily mean, we'd go to failure, we'd have to get a spot, and then we'd have to do multiple negatives with your partner pushing down on the weight. There's not a ton of evidence to suggest that provides any benefit over what, the straight set would have done, but it's kind of neat to do sometimes, just to feel what that's like. I don't mind soreness, but I think you need to, for the beginner kids, I really think they need to start to force that adaptation to see how much they can handle.
Well, this is probably something that's hard to truly measure, right? But it's training the will, it's training the mindset. Your first response when I opened up at the beginning was beliefs and mindset, right? Guys don't believe that they can build muscle after 40. Sometimes when you do those crazy things, we used to start chest workouts with 10 sets of 10 on 225. Like, that was our first rep scheme, and we would go back and forth. Me and my training partner, we'd go back and forth. There'd be no rest other than when the other person is going, and that just got us started for like another 30 sets. But I think that there was we were training a capacity, we were training a will, a belief, something within us that when the hard stuff gets hard, we can continue to push it through it. And I know that's probably something that's not measurable to a certain degree, but it's like, I know that helped me later on in life.
Yeah, and there's the whole side to this. Probably John Perillo was the one who decades ago was talking about the detraining of the Golgi tendon organ. I mentioned earlier that a lot of your ability to recruit and perform another repetition is psychological. It's your perceived level of exertion. Your body is, very adept at protecting itself from injury. And one of the ways it does that is with these muscle spindles, the Golgi tendon organ being one for the tendons, that kind of determine whether or not this load is potentially injurious. And Perillo always believed you could desensitize the Golgi tendon organ by overloading it, such that your body would be more inclined to be able to do an extra repetition because you'd experienced that before and it wasn't injurious. And so, whether or not I think all of that is I mean, it sounds good in theory, but I'm not sure that's exactly how it works. But and I've trained with John Perillo. I've been out to his place in Cincinnati and worked with him and done some of these workouts. Where your partner lifts the bar up for you, or even on squatting, he has that belt squat machine where your partner actually literally picks you up, and then you just kind of slow as you can decelerate, huge loads, and that's just eccentric training, and we've done that for years with weight releasers and other fashions. Not a huge fan of that because of the DOMs that it creates. Although a lot of those adaptations decrease the amount of DOMs over time from repeated exposure, as we know from things like the novel stimulus. The new exercises initially are, you incur a lot of DOMs from them, but then as you continue to repeat to do them, you recur less and less. So that's part of the adaptative process of the body, both in terms of metabolite accumulation physiologically, and then psychologically, like we mentioned, in terms of your brain being able to just not be intimidated by those loads anymore. And over time, you're just able to exert more effort and recruit more muscle tissue just from the neural stimulation from your brain. And that's a trained trait, as mentioned, that Pat Davison was talking about. And how do you do that unless you kind of push yourself there? I'm not suggesting that you do that immediately. I'm saying that when you're designing a program, that you want to do that with some level of progression, but you got to push there. Now, we know with strength, what the other side might argue is that we know with strength that you're actually better off leaving a couple reps in the tank rather than grinding reps. We don't see an improvement in strength from that. With heavier weights, say 85% of your 1 rep max, you might be able to get a grind of 5. Maybe doing a triple well, not maybe, but what the research suggests is that doing a triple without grinding is going to give you a better adaptation. You're going to be able to gain strength more consistently over a longer period of time.